You are now watching Surveillance. Donate or subscribe for more sick twists.
Okay, hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about the one-button macro for Wrath of the Lich King Ret Paladins. This macro has been kind of endorsed by a lot of different content creators out there, which is why it sort of feels necessary for me to make this video to kind of dispel some of the misinformation out there, kind of clear things up by explaining why the macro is actually kind of bad. So FCFS refers to first come, first serve. When people talk about the Wrath rotation, they're typically talking about FCFS, which is basically just you're using your abilities as they come off cooldown. Now, that covers most of it, but it also is kind of a misnomer for the times where, you know, sometimes you have multiple abilities coming off cooldown at the same time, and you can choose between them. So it's not exactly first come first serve, but this is generally what it's referred to. So if you see this acronym, now you know what it means. But a better way of thinking about this is it's a priority list that you're following. And this priority will actually be different depending on if you're doing single target or cleave, or if you have 4 mobs, or if you have 10 mobs, you would rank consecrate higher the more mobs you get, etc. It's not going to be the same on every fight. Also, the position of Judgment of Wisdom can vary. It's not going to be as high if you're following strictly DPS priority, but it's usually placed pretty high because it's pretty important to judge often to replenish people's mana. So this is the macro that most people use or refer to when they talk about the one-button macro for Ret. I've tried a few different macros now, and this does seem to be one of the better ones at least. Now there's a couple issues though with this. This requires the Holy Wrath glyph, which is not actually the best glyph you could be using. Right now Consecrate glyph is doing much better, and so is Exorcism glyph, with Consecrate being in the lead. So I don't really know why you would be using the Holy Wrath glyph, because it's just flat out worse than Consecrate is. And I mean worse, like even on Undead Demon Cleave fights, it's still worse. In fact, Holy Wrath isn't even worth casting when you have other abilities you can use most of the time. It's only a DPS gain if you have like 4 mobs or more that are Undead or Demon, and you can't cast Divine Storm or Consecrate or even Crusader Strike, which cleaves. Without the Holy Wrath glyph, you're going to have to let the macro reset back to the first spell by not pressing it for 2 seconds. Otherwise, the macro is just going to sit there and hang on Holy Wrath and be stuck there until it comes off cooldown. To make Holy Wrath work in this macro, you would need a much longer macro. That is possible, and that is something we're going to talk about later in the video, although you might hit the character limit. So the Holy Wrath version is basically useless. You would never be using the glyph anyway, you hardly are ever going to cast it, and it's just going to make the macro screw up and hang on Holy Wrath if you don't have the glyph. So just keep in mind that we are going to delete Holy Wrath off of the end of this macro and test that instead. If you just delete Holy Wrath, then you'll get the normal rotation cast sequence macro that most people will use when they talk about it, when they make videos about it. This is the macro that Scottejaye used in his video, and MetaGoblin used when he was playing Ret on the beta, and of course this is the one that Tareyak uses. So now it just goes through the spells one at a time in a sequence. It always goes in the same order. So one other thing that you'll notice about the macro is that it has Consecrate higher in the priority than Exorcism, hence the earlier cast. But it seems like on non-demon targets, Consecrate is actually just better. But this macro presumes that you're using Glyph of Holy Wrath, which would mean an undead or demon target. So it's kind of contradictory in that sense. So you can reorder this macro a lot of different ways and get very similar DPS over a longer fight. which you'll see later in the video because we're going to go into the sim on WoW Sims and sort of test a bunch of different cast sequence macros, a couple different orders, and see is this even the best macro, how close can the macro get, etc. So let's pull up the sim and see what it says about this, because surprise surprise, we can actually sim cast sequence macros rather easily against our standard priority list. So let's take a look at that and see how the macro lines up. Okay, so here we have the Wrath of the Lich King sim for Ret Paladin. This is in alpha, but it's pretty good so far. I've been testing it quite a bit, and I gotta say, I'm a big fan of some of the work these guys have put in on this. So just to get started, let's run through how you can use it. Here you have your encounter settings. You can set the NPC to whatever you want. You can come down here to advanced and change the armor and the mob type. We're going to leave it on demon for now. You can actually even change the execute duration, so we can set this to 100 later, and we can test the execute macro against our spell priority system, and we can see how it's going to do during execute phase. And then we're going to take Hammer of Wrath off of the spell priority, and then we're going to test the regular macro versus the spell priority, and so we're going to test separately, basically, execute phase and normal phase separately. Otherwise, we're going to get some inaccurate results. So lots of great customization here. These are the settings that I'm using. Pretty standard debuffs, buffs, cooldowns. This is the spell priority system we're going to be using with Hammer of Wrath, Judge, Crusader Strike, Divine Storm, Exorcism, Consecrate. So first what we're going to do is we're going to check our gear, just in case you guys want to know what gear I'm using. Here's the gear. I basically am just using the set that was provided for the preset for phase 1. Settings you've already seen. Here's all the talents. Here's the glyphs. We will be messing with the glyphs a little bit when we test the Holy Wrath part, but I'll show you that later. So for now, we're using Glyph of Consecrate because it is seemingly the best one at the moment. These 3 are going to be your best glyphs according to the sim so far. So that's what we're going to stick with. And then here you have a detailed results tab that really goes in depth into how your damage plays out over the fight. So also, one thing I didn't mention with encounters is that you can add targets, so you can sim cleave, which is really useful. So the first thing we're going to do is just get a DPS number for our spell priority system that we've set up here, and just see how much DPS we're going to gain based on the sim using its standard settings with everything I've already showed you. So let's see. Okay, about 6190, 6195. That's pretty good. Now let's take a look at if we move Judge a little bit down. Maybe we can get a little bit more damage at execute phase. We can gain maybe 10 DPS by moving Hammer of Wrath up. So we're just going to keep Judgment of Wisdom at the top. For mana reasons, you're probably going to prioritize it a little bit more. So let's leave that there for now. So next what we're going to do is we're going to take out Hammer of Wrath, and we're going to sim just regular phase, and we're not going to sim any of execute phase. So what we're going to do is we're going to come into advanced and set this to 0, 0, 0. Close it out. Just make sure that that's saved. Yep. So now there is no execute phase. There's no Hammer of Wrath. Everything that we're testing here is just for regular phase, and let's get a number. Okay, so we're losing about 100 DPS, 105 DPS. 6090 is our new number. Let's test this against our cast sequence macro. So here I have our cast sequence macro. This is the same order that Tareyak had his set to. If you remove Holy Wrath from the end, this is the exact same order as you see in his video and what I showed you earlier. So let's get a number for this. As you can see here, you're losing 200 to 300 DPS just by using the macro. No matter what you do, if you only use the macro, you're losing 200 to 300 DPS on single target fight with phase 1 Bisque gear. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to come down here, we're going to add Holy Wrath like the original macro has. We're going to keep it at the bottom because it's the last thing that's casted. And we're going to, first we're going to test this just alone. All we did is add Holy Wrath to the macro. That's all we did. We don't have the glyph. Let's see what it does. Oof. Ouch, that hurts. This is 1,000 DPS less than we had earlier with our normal priority system, no macro. This is 1,000 DPS less is putting Holy Wrath in here. Now, maybe it's because when you get to Holy Wrath, the macro can hang if you don't have the glyph. So let's try putting on the glyph, which, need I remind you, it's not the best glyph you could be using. There's probably not many situations where you would ever use this glyph, but let's give it a shot and see what happens. Well, that's a little better, I guess. We're still about 700 DPS below where we were, maybe a little bit more, with the priority system. But yeah, that's a pretty significant hit. It's a little bit better, but it's pretty significantly less. So as you can see, having Holy Wrath in this macro at all just doesn't make sense, unless we do something about the order, which we will work with here. Okay, so next thing we can do is we can get rid of Holy Wrath again. We're going to change the glyph back to the best glyph, which is Consecrate. We're going to come back to settings, and let's just try playing around with the order a little bit, right? Let's move down Judge. So we have CS, Judge, Divine Storm, CS, Judge, Divine Storm. We will do, move this up, move this up. We'll go like this. And then remove Holy Wrath. What else? What else? What else? I think that's it, right? Yeah. Okay. So let's try this. See what happens. Okay. So as you can see, very similar amount of DPS as the original Tareyak macro order. This is the order that you see in those Wrath rotation gifts, but with a little bit of nuance here at the end to make the macro properly repeat, because if you just use the first 6 spells, it doesn't properly repeat. You have to go out to 9. So okay, pretty much as long as you keep CS every 3 spells, and you keep Divine Storm, what is that, 6? 1, 2, yeah, 6 apart, then the amount of DPS you get for moving things around is pretty minimal, honestly. It's there's not a lot to be gained by trying to find better orders. The only way to really make a better order here is to make a really, really long macro, because if you look at the rotation and you try to find a point where it actually repeats, you actually have to go out to a lot more spells, and you're gonna pass the character limit on creating a macro. I've heard there's a few ways to increase the character limit up to 1,053 or something like that using an add-on, but that's what it would take to build a macro that basically does FCFS on its own. You would need to, you know, include a lot more spells, and that's just going to make it a lot harder to theorycraft and create, and, you know, if it's even possible. So once again, let's come back here and go to standard or custom. This is our spell priority system, right? So let's just once again, for comparison's sake, you can see here we're gaining 300 DPS. So bar none, bottom line, first biggest problem with the macro is that you're always losing DPS. No matter what you do, you're always losing DPS. The macro can never be equal to or better than playing as you're supposed to. It can only be worse. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to come back in here. We're going to set execute duration 20 to 100. We're just going to set these all to 100. But 20 is the only one that really matters. So this is going to make it so that the entire fight is execute phase. We're going to come back down here. We're going to have we have our Hammer of Wrath included now on our custom list. Let's sim it and make sure we have the right glyphs here. Yep, okay, so let's sim it and see what happens. Okay. 66, almost 6666. We were so close to greatness. Okay, so 6667 DPS. That's execute phase only. Let's take a look at Tareyak's macro for execute phase. Okay, so now that I have Tareyak's macro pulled up, I've plugged it into the cast sequence. This is the execute macro. It's just 6 spells: Hammer of Wrath, Judge, Crusader Strike, Divine Storm, Consecrate, Crusader Strike. Now, if you're on an undead or demon target, it's actually going to be better to use Exorcism here for the first go around, but after that it'll be on cooldown and you'll go back to Consecrate. But for now we're just going to use the macro as it's stated in the video that Tareyak made. So let's see the DPS here. Yeah, 900, I think 900 DPS less than not using a macro. And of course, if you don't trust me, I will put the link to the sim in the description. It's still an alpha, but it's pretty dang good. So if you don't trust me, you know, you can do all this stuff yourself. You can even test in-game and you'll see pretty similar results, but you have to make sure that if you test in-game that you do a lot of damage, which can take a really long time, so that you have a high sample size, which the sim can do in seconds. So I recommend using the sim, but you can also test this in-game. Just make sure that you have a high enough sample size. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a couple clips of some in-game testing. This first clip is me using the original macro and just showing that without the glyph of Holy Wrath, it gets caught on the second Holy Wrath and gets stuck. So here's a clip of me using the macro like normal. I have Seal of Command up and I'm doing the cleave test. So basically, as you can see, the macro does not use your abilities as efficiently as it could. There's times where it's got open GCDs where it could cast a spell. There's times where it picks the spell that does the least DPS or less DPS than something else that is ready at the time. So it's really inflexible and rigid and cannot really adapt to when things are off cooldown. The only solution to this is letting the macro reset at times, which is just going to mean that you're spending 2 seconds doing nothing just to let your macro reset. So I'm not the best at doing the Wrath rotation perfectly, but I am alright at it. It's not that hard, and basically in general, after a lot of testing and averaging, I usually was seeing about 100 to 150 DPS more when I would not use the macro as opposed to using the macro. I tested this for a few hours, but it's really hard to get a lot of sample size compared to using the sim. So I recommend basing most of your opinions off the sim. In his video, Tareyak talks about cast random and how using a cast random macro, which basically casts your spells at random depending on whatever's off cooldown, how it used to be really similar to playing normally DPS wise, which is true. It was pretty close, and the reason is because most of your abilities on single target have a very similar amount of damage done per GCD. But cast sequence is not the same thing as cast random. Cast random can no longer be used because Blizzard disabled it. And even cast random was still slightly worse than playing properly or FCFS. Even back in the days of elitist jerks in 2008, 2009, they knew that there was at least a 2% difference between using a one-button rotation macro and playing normally. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go through Tareyak's video and we're just going to kind of pick it apart segment by segment, and then I'll react to each little segment.
Today's topic relates to the Blacks of Azeroth, the Retribution Paladins. Mostly seen as the meme spec up until late, the Retribution Paladin is just weeks away from a baptism of light and class changes that take them from 0 to hero.
Okay, so is it just me, or is it like incredibly tasteless to make that joke and compare Ret Paladins to the plight of black people in America, or the world, presumably? And if taken at its worst, like, kinda racist. Also, like, 0 to hero, how bad does he think Ret Paladins are right now in TBC? Like, 0? Like, and how good does he think Ret Paladins are in Wrath?
My macro, the Tareyak one-tapper macro, has nothing to do with randomness. It replicates a 6-9 rotation sequence that should, in my estimation, give you at least 95% of the most optimal FCFS rotation.
So here he gives us his estimate of 95% of FCFS, which is not too far off considering what we've seen on the sim. 300 DPS of 6,000 is about 5%, but what he doesn't say is that 5% in the grand scheme of playing WoW is like a lot. Like, that is more than most gear upgrades would ever give you.
This, of course, is comparing to most optimal rotation. I dare say there might only be a handful of people on Earth who could reduce that in a raid environment consistently.
So how hard does this guy think it is to play Wrath as Ret? I mean, it's not that hard. Surely a lot of people would be able to do it perfectly.
However, we are now starting to beg the question, where is the proof, Tareyak? The min-max proof will be from the logs, realistically in ICC, so we gotta wait till then for that.
So for some weird reason he thinks that we need to wait for ICC logs to see how the macro does. Well, as I showed you earlier, we can just sim it. Also, we can test it in game, but it takes a really long time.
In case you missed it, here's a clip from Scottejaye's Ret's pre-patch DPS video.
For the Ret Paladin in particular, due to the big brain Rets that were in the stream, we're using a 1-button car sequence macro. This just saved me time setting bars up, getting to grips with the rotation. I was assured that this macro on screen will perform equally to anybody who's actually manually doing the rotation. Feel free to argue that in the comments, I don't know, it's just what I was told.
So in my opinion, this is like kind of irresponsible for Scottejaye to do, to kind of endorse the macro. Now, I think it's also funny that Tareyak thinks that Scottejaye mentioning the macro validates him and his macro, which is just hilarious. It's like even more hilarious when you think about the expert he's talking about in his chat is most likely just Tareyak. And lastly, of course, as we've already proved in this video, the macro will not perform equally, always slightly worse at the least. So again, this is why you need to be concerned about misinformation out there, because Scottejaye basically makes this video, he talks to Tareyak in his chat, and he doesn't double check any of this stuff. He just puts the video out, and now I have a ton of people asking me about the 1-button macro and why it's good and why it's equal to or better than playing normally. So be very careful out there. These people do not double check or test these assumptions. Scottejaye here literally just talked to Tareyak in his own stream chat and went based off of that.
Now, Scotty done 2.4k DPS with my macro unbuffed in that video. Now, MetaGoblin later released a video similar but raid buffed, except when he done red, he wasn't using the macro, he was using first come first serve. Let's see a clip of that.
Retribution unfortunately wasn't very impressive. It peaked at 2,500, but it didn't really drop that much after you've bursted, kept at about 2,400.
MetaGoblin is doing the same DPS raid buffed that Scotty's doing unbuffed, because he done first come first serve. Now, luckily, MetaGoblin has done an updated version in where he uses my macro. Let's take a look at the damage now.
We managed to get the Ret Paladin to pump a lot more as well. He was going at 4,300 at its peak, and then tapering off to an average of 3,000 at 500.
This is at least a 30% DPS increase to first come first serve, just by using Tareyak's 1-tapper macro.
Wow, just amazing. Truly the most scientifically rigorous test they could have done. Statisticians everywhere would be so proud. Wow, amazing. Okay, so awful test aside, it's easily explained that the reason why anyone would gain DPS from this macro is because they just weren't pressing their buttons fast enough or in the right order, most likely a combination of both. That's the only way you would ever gain DPS from this macro, and it's much better to just learn the class, right? When he says a 30% DPS upgrade, he is purposefully trying to be vague. He is purposefully trying to get the idea in your mind that if I use this macro, it will be a DPS upgrade. Why? I can only guess because it's got his name on it, and that's why he wants people to use the macro. But no, there is no way that you're going to get a 30% DPS increase from this macro. This test is hilarious. It is laughable. The only way you're getting any DPS increase from this macro is if you don't know how to play the class and you don't want to learn.
Like I mentioned before, there's so much extra value you get from this macro, from being able to focus on timers, positioning, raid mechanics, raid frames, raid leading. But even though this is just pure DPS measurements, it's a DPS increase straight up for some of you.
I mean, once again, really, does he think it's that hard to play the class and watch your timers at the same time? How hard does he think Wrath is as Ret? Anyways, also, once again, he's trying to get you to think this macro is a DPS increase. You know, I personally think that you guys are smarter than that. I think that you guys are perfectly capable of playing the rotation on your own and not having to, you know, use this as like a crutch. Okay, so remember earlier where I showed this text? I'm just going to go over some of this a little bit now, specifically the top part. So any good macro that's going to replicate your rotation is going to depend on so many different things, like how much spell haste you have, because remember, this is going to shorten the GCD on your spells like Exorcism and Consecrate and change the way that the rotation plays out. The T7 4 set and the T10 2 set, like the T10 2 set will make your Divine Storm reset sometimes, and the macro cannot account for this at all. In fact, in Tareyak's own video where he shills the macro, he is actually wearing the tier 10 2 set, and he lets his Divine Storm sit off of cooldown for like a really long time because he has no ability to use it after it procs. He has to wait until the macro comes around, which is honestly so funny to me. Like, how could he not understand this and how much worse the macro would be? Also, the Consecrate glyph, if you're using it or if you're not using it, it's going to change the priority you want to have with it, how many mobs there are, anything that changes the way your CDs work, the enemy type, demon or undead or not, AoE or non-AoE, once again, how many targets, what kind of targets are they, and there's probably a lot more variables out there that will change the way you want to prioritize your rotation, which is why it's better to learn the class yourself, and then you can go, oh, I got 4 mobs here, Divine Storm is like my highest damage ability, I'm going to prioritize that. Divine Storm's coming off cooldown at the same time as Crusader Strike, well, Divine Storm's going to be better here, etc. And you lose that ability when you use the macro. Okay guys, so I think that about does it for this video. I know it was kind of long, but I really wanted to get to the heart of this problem and go super in depth and just make it so that nobody can ever come back from this. The macro is worse. We know that to be true. And if you are bad enough or you just don't understand the class enough to the point where the macro could be a DPS gain, I highly recommend that you just learn the class instead, and I will be pumping out a ton of videos to help you do that, and I promise you that you will have more fun anyway, because who wants to do a one-button rotation anyway? Okay? So, thanks to Sulis and Watcher7. Sulis worked on the TBC sim with Pride, and both of them are working on the Wrath sim. Thanks to both of them for helping me with this video. I really appreciate all the work they put in to help me get all this stuff figured out. And once again, thanks guys for watching. If you want to support me on Patreon, you can do that in the link in the description, and I will have all of the resources, including the Wrath sim, down there. If you like this video and you want to see more, comment, subscribe, like, whatever, you know. Thanks. I appreciate it. I really do. I actually have a new mic coming shortly, so apologies for the voice quality. I hope it's adequate, but I will be getting a new mic. Should be here on Sunday, so that should help. And I also have bought a copy of Adobe Premiere, so you might see a little bit of a change in the way my videos are edited. I just need to take some time to learn how to use the new software. So have a good day, guys. And please be careful who you get your information from. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and I would hate for you guys to play worse because of it.
This show was brought to you by Light Club, where monkeys go to church.